Hello, and welcome everybody to, according to Andrew, number 69, Anti-Fragility. Fragility. Ugh. Uh, Vox had been talking about this on his blog recently, and he did a podcast on it that I've been behind on, but I caught up with the other day, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to go through this concept, and also at the end of the little blurb that he put out, he said, I would critique these four strategies in my next post on the subject. In the meantime, feel free to discuss their strengths and weaknesses and guess which one of the four I find to be A, so typical, and B, amusingly wrong. So we're going to try to take our crack at it. I haven't read the comments and taken any ideas from them. I'm just going to use my own intuition. So let's dive into the article, and then from there, we will discuss those ideas. So, it doesn't appear that the mainstream strategists have figured out an effective approach to attacking an anti-fragile opponent. If this article in Military Strategy magazine is any guide, we might take a crack at this, but it's really hard. Um, but my sister did have an interesting idea, and I don't think it applies, but I do think it is nonetheless a good idea. Uh, so with that in mind, so anti-fragile adversaries okay. Antifragile adversaries may lose their potential if the strategic performance they face is inappropriate to the capabilities, or if they lack the time to adapt. Um, I thought they was going to define this. Hold up. Okay. Well, let's define anti-fragile first. I thought they were defined in the article. My bad. Um, so you kind of have three different levels. You have fragile, resilient, and anti-fragile. Fragile is basically they're a very weak opponent. They can fight you, and if they win, they're fine. But the instant they lose, they basically crumble. So a classic is we're mainly going to use war for this, but this can be applied in many different settings. But war is just the easiest way to show an example for this. So one of the best examples for this is the War of 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, that was ended in like literally a battle. It was like 3 months. Another maybe good example of this is the United States conflict in the first Iraq War. You could maybe argue, but just because of how quickly that happened, but they didn't actually remove Saddam from power, so that's actually probably a bad example. So ignore that second one. But 1871 is a good example. It was basically the French lost and surrendered within 3 months and helped establish Germany as its own nation and one that was going to be the central power of Europe until they dragged America into European affairs to beat up on Germany twice in a row. Anyway, and right there, that kind of shows some anti-fragility to a certain extent too, where they had to beat them up twice to do that. But that doesn't really apply to our things. Okay, so a resilient opponent, that's going to be the United States right now. They have lots of resources. They can they can take losses and withstand them, and continue to fight and fight and fight for long periods of time. Rome is probably another good example of a resilient opponent, where if you read about their battles against Carthage a long time ago, they would wipe their armies constantly, and well, not constantly, but often enough that like almost any other nation at that time period would have surrendered and given up and completely collapsed under the uh, weight of having to recruit an entirely new army. And Rome wouldn't do this, and eventually they would win the war of attrition. And these usually devolve into attrition. The article gets into that. Anti-fragile opponent is someone who, when you take and attack them, they actually get stronger over time. I believe the article touches on this, but the example that is used a lot is when the Thebans were fighting the Spartans. So Thebes was another city-state in Greece back in the day. And so on their first encounter with the Spartans, they fought and they lost, but they weren't destroyed. On their second encounter with the Spartans, they basically had a draw. The third encounter, they beat them, and the fourth encounter, they absolutely demolished Sparta. And so basically, Sparta taught them how to be better and get better and become a stronger opponent. And so that's generally how anti-fragility works, is engagements with an anti-fragile opponent make them stronger the next time you go to fight them. So that's why you generally want to avoid fighting them, because it's, you don't want your opponent to get stronger, and if attacking them makes them stronger and you weaker, that's a really bad situation to be in. So let's get into it. Anti-fragile adversaries might lose their potential in their strategic performance they face in if the strategic performance they face is inappropriate to their capabilities or they lack the time to adapt. This does not just turn the anti-fragile adversaries into resilient ones. I guess I did it backwards. I don't know what's in between fragile and anti-fragile. Anyway, um, the relationships between the specific characteristics of the adversary form a triangle rather than a linear hierarchy. Therefore, one-time anti-fragility does not guarantee a safe landing into the resilience zone. So, okay, so take everything I said about resilience and anti-fragile and flip them. I did it backwards. My bad. Uh, Anti-fragile adversaries can be rendered fragile without becoming resilient ones. Strategists have several options to make this happen. This includes sequential and cumulative strategies, as well as the strategy of annihilation and the deliberate use of peace. The first option includes rapid executed sequential strategies to deny the adversary the time to get stronger. The theory of victory, he relies on quick sequential campaign. I don't know why I'm having trouble pronouncing that. By which the strategist robs the adversary of the time to improve the latter's military capabilities. The adversary can counter this by refusing to engage at all, but then he deliberately robs himself of the opportunity to improve his military capabilities through strategic performance. Sequential strategy can therefore force the adversary out of his anti-fragile mode by either delaying him the time to adapt or by rendering him unable to engage in the kind of strategic performance that would increase his military capability. The critical requirement for this approach is to have logistics effective enough to support the continual and relentless push into the adversary's territory. However, this strategy contains high risk of morphing into attrition. This sequential strategy can be interrupted in any moment by the adversary, as well as by friction and chance inherent in strategic practice. Any serious interruption gives the adversary the time to grow stronger and increase the probabilities of turning the strategy into attrition. Still, the rapid sequential strategy may be useful when trying to achieve limited territorial objectives rather than a regime change. This is so because the pursuit of limited objectives contains fewer opportunities for interruption. The suitability of the strategy, therefore, varies widely with political objectives of the strategist. Um, Also, something they don't mention there is you don't have. We'll get back to this, but this assumes that they have to engage in every fight that they are presented with, which is not true in general. Uh, the second option is the strategy of decisive battle, which seeks to annihilate the adversary's force in one engagement. The theory of victory behind this approach resides in the delivery of overwhelming challenge to the adversary. Such strategic performance destroys the adversary's military capabilities and associated chance to grow stronger. To pull this off, the strategist needs the cooperation of the adversary and sufficient military capabilities of his own. The adversary must accept the time and the place of the decisive battle. The strategist that needs to be able to defeat him. The adversary may decline the battle, but by this he again robs himself of the opportunity to become stronger through strategic performance. On the other hand, the failure to annihilate substantial forces of the adversary during the battle may result in the struggle of attrition. Spartans were often able to here's the example. The Spartans were often able to force the Thebans to accept battle, but they failed to annihilate the latter. Consequently, their hopes of annihilation turned into the practice of attrition, which benefited the Thebans. Another problem is the contemporary strategic practice seldom allows strategists to analyze a large portion of the adversary's military capabilities in one engagement. This has to do as much with the size of the arms as with the ways in which they are deployed. Strategists may be able to pull decisive battles off against unskilled, employed small-size armed forces, but this is unlikely to happen in wars between superpowers and even mediumly sized armies. Suitability of the strategy therefore varies with relative size or the adversary armed with the ways they're employed. And one thing I want to note on, I feel like they're pulling one of the ideas that comes from the Fourth Generation Warfare Handbook of Lind, which is he he basically says that Fourth Generation Warfare opponents have a tendency to, you basically have to do like kind of win over the hearts and minds strategy with them, because the moral level is the highest level, and the only way to do the physical is to basically eliminate them in all one go. And that is almost I'm pretty sure he notes this in the book. That is almost never an option with fourth generation warfare opponents. And the one example that he had was actually from Syria, with I forgot who the leader is, but the guy they're trying to depose in Syria right now, the American army. Um, and he had a way of doing this, but that was because the enemy was concentrated in this one spot. He knew they were planning to destroy him in this one spot, and they basically all in the space of one night came in, leveled the entire town, killing like everybody, and said, "Don't ever go against me again." Now, here's the thing: most Western powers not willing to do that. Uh, Secondly, that is a very unique situation where, because they were in like the scheming conspiracy level of plan, they were far more concentrated as a force than they would normally would be as a fourth generation unit. So those are two notes I wanted to add on that. We'll come back to this. The third option is to use cumulative strategy of underwhelming attacks to exhaust the adversary. The theory of victory in this case resides in the contextual attacks conducted below the level of the adversary's current capabilities. The approach gives the adversary military capability no opportunity for growth because the latter is already above the level of the attacks. In this ideal case, cumulative strategy is the sort that applies violence unilaterally in order to avoid the interaction with the adversary altogether. Terrorist attacks or raids are ideal examples of this approach, but occasionally battles may also work. The key difference between this strategy and the search for attrition is for the former purposely limits the frequency and the intensity of the violence interactions, while the latter does the opposite. The strategy is unlikely to destroy the adversary's military capabilities, but by denying the adversary the opportunity to grow stronger, the strategist may be able to exhaust the adversary. The strategy is most likely to succeed if the strategist purposes limited objectives and the adversary does not value the objectives very much. There are considerable limits to the effectiveness of the strategy. The strategist may be unable to do enough damage over time to exhaust the adversary. This may happen because of the intentional weakness of the attacks or because the adversary is able to recover from them. Most importantly, even the strategy can turn into a detrimental attempts to attrite, I can't speak. The confidence elicited in the successful conduct of repeated attacks may boost the strategist's confidence as well as increase the efforts he is willing to put up with. Once he feels strong enough, he may recklessly escalate his endeavor into a struggle where the search for attrition replaces the more modest aim of exhaustion. The suitability of the strategy then varies with the political objectives of the strategist, with his own capability to exercise restraint, with the value of adversity, and ascribes the objectives. The last option is to use peace. This is to deliberately abstain from the use of violence. In this scenario, the theory of victory relies on the detrimental consequences of peace on the adversary's military capabilities, as well as the supplemental use of nonviolent instruments of power. In general, peace tends to have a negative impact on cohesion of society as well as military capabilities in particular. Conflict lies between different segments of society tend to grow, and military forces gradually face gradual capability degradation as consequences of not facing appropriate challenges. Governments seldom seem to prioritize the development of military capabilities to the extent that this happens in war. To put it simply, in peace, most people care about things other than war. The great demobilization that followed the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and the 1990s are good examples of this tendency. Furthermore, some nonviolent instruments of power tend to be stronger in peace than in times of war. Propaganda, for example, is more effective in peace than during the war because it amplifies the already present conflict lines within society. During war, societies tend to get more homogeneous and united when facing common adversity, leaving little space for the exacerbation of conflict lines. So that is the article. And the thing I wanted to kind of take away from this is, so let's go through all of them. I guess we'll go backwards. So first we have peace. Um, as sure, if you're talking purely from a fighting force standpoint, that might be true. But if you look at the Chinese fifth generation warfare, they see warfare as being fought on multiple lines and not just with military force. So therefore, any adversary that you're fighting that sees conflict in that way, your use of peace will effectively not work. Next, this idea of really small attacks boring the enemy into submission. Maybe works. Doesn't seem like it would be a good strategy. In my opinion, so basically this idea is kind of what the only way this works is kind of what the terrorists do to state militaries, and that's because they're basically fighting non-trained militias, and they can beat them up so effectively that they basically lose their edge. It's kind of the same effect that happens in peace, but the reason it specifically affects these nations is because their actions that they're taking they know are immoral, and they are losing the moral section of the fourth generation warfare grid, and because of that they're fighting capabilities degrade as their morale degrades. So this works, but in a very, very defined context. Okay, the decisive battle one I think is probably the one that he's saying is laughable, because like I framed, the decisive battle is almost never an option because usually your forces are so dispersed that this isn't a thing. And two, if you were able to be defeated in a decisive battle like the French in 1871, you wouldn't be an anti-fragile opponent. You would be a fragile one. So this doesn't make any sense. And then the last thing, the first option includes sequential strategies deny the advert. So, and then the first option basically continually attack them and push them and make it so that they can't ever have time to recover. Probably Barbarossa, Operation Barbarossa is probably a good example of this. If the Germans had been able to, hadn't had their supply lines so stretched, and they were able to keep the offensive up, and then on the flip side, the Russians, as they did it back to the Germans, basically continually pressuring them so that they can't ever have a chance to recover and reset the front line and stuff like that. But a lot of times, how this works doesn't necessarily come into play. And what you actually have happen is these sequential strategies you just choose not to engage. So especially when you're talking with like fourth generation warfare or a lot of these lawfare type things where you can kind of pick and choose your battles. So it's much more akin to the Fabius strategy and the fights with Hannibal, where both Hannibal and Fabius were very good at choosing their the fights that they were going to fight, and the only time Hannibal was basically forced into an unwinnable fight that he already knew things weren't going to work out for him, basically, or knew it was much more of a toss-up than he would like it to be before he fought the battle, was when Scipio kind of forced him to come back to Carthage, and then they fought basically a field battle right outside of Carthage, and then he lost. So this sequential attack thing can work in theory, but that's only if they decide to keep engaging you and exhausting their resources to the point that they can't continue and then they collapse. If they just choose to not engage you and, give you a win here or there, lose the battle but win the war kind of thing, which is the logic for a truly anti-fragile thing, I believe would be the way that you're thinking about this stuff, then this doesn't work either. So, I don't know about actual ways. The best idea, my sister had kind of mentioned basically trying to outflank people, and I thought that was a pretty clever idea. So basically, if they're going to if they're engaging in this way, then you try to subvert it. It's basically fifth generation warfare, right? So America is better at sea lane, or like basically America controls the seas. What is the Japanese option? So they have the head-on option, which is that they build a navy to challenge the United States at sea, or they do the sidestep option, which is build hypersonic missiles that can sink all of the U.S. Navy if they try to land in China, and build because they're in the Eurasian um, landmass. Basically, they have almost the entire landmass to themselves. They build a railway, a Silk Road from China all the way to Europe, and create a lane of commerce and prosperity along this with this transportation system, meaning making it so you don't even need uh, oceans at all. So that's a way you can kind of outflank people. The problem is what happens when, and the only reason this is working on America is because uh, for you could, well, Trump was starting to fight back, but outside of Trump, the only reason this outflank maneuver was working on America is because America refused to acknowledge China as its enemy and how it was fighting on all these different fronts. The instant you have someone fighting on and realize they're fighting on all these fronts, you've kind of secured the front line, and eventually you're going to have basically just two trenches facing each other, because you're going to have a situation of like the Western Front in World War One, right? So the war breaks out and each side's fighting, and then they basically they try to outflank each other from the Swiss border all the way to the Atlantic, and neither of them can, and then they just dig trenches, and the only way forward is through the enemy, straight on, head on. The Germans find a creative way to get around this, but that's a side point. So basically what's going to happen is once two countries start fighting each other on every single possible front, and there's nowhere to flank anymore, then we'll see kind of how things play out and how that war actually works out. So if America was fighting the Chinese on the economic and technological property right type stuff, and control of sea lanes and commerce, I'm kind of repeating stuff, and warfare, and information technology, and just like information warfare, hacking, tech attacks, anything, like any way that you could think you could fight the Chinese and beat them, propaganda, things like that, and you're targeting at the Chinese and the Chinese are targeting at you, like that's when we see that clash happen on all this, then we'll see what really happens. And I'm not sure we've had a war like that. Maybe World War II. Maybe that's maybe as close as we've seen so far. That like total war, but it'll be interesting to see what total fifth generation warfare looks like. It will be very interesting. But that's potentially your only way to defeat an anti-fragile opponent and prevent them from. The problem is if the outflank doesn't work and they just create a way to secure their flank again, that these are the kind of things that change an anti-fragile opponent into a resilient opponent. And I realize I got that backwards at the beginning of this thing, but you guys get it. So yeah, that kind of basically summarizes my thoughts on that. Hopefully you guys found this interesting, and that basically wraps it up for me. Do your thing. You're liking, your comments, subscribing. I read them if you post them. So yeah, have a good day. Goodbye.